The young heiress decides to humiliate the barista in a luxury cafe, but his response surprises everyone. The entrance door produced a soft chime as it was pushed open. The unmistakable aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the air of Maison du Café, one of the city's most prestigious establishments. The walls, lined with dark wood panels, exuded elegance, while crystal chandeliers reflected soft light dancing across the pristine marble floor. Every detail, from the fresh floral arrangements on the counters to the velvet-upholstered chairs, seemed meticulously curated to convey exclusivity. Here, luxury was subtle yet ever-present, like a whisper audible only to the attentive. Amid polite murmurs and the occasional clink of porcelain cups, Claire emerged, instantly changing the atmosphere. The sound of her heels echoed with confidence, drawing curious glances. Clad in a flawless ensemble by a French designer, she displayed understated yet clearly expensive jewelry. Her blonde hair was swept into a sophisticated chignon, and her expensive perfume seemed to announce her arrival even before she was visible. With a sly smile, she glided toward the counter as though she believed the world revolved around her. "I'd like a table by the window," Claire declared to the host in a tone that brooked no opposition. The young man, with a polite smile, gestured toward the perfect corner of the room, but she interrupted him with a subtle gesture, indicating another table she deemed more appropriate. "This one will do better," she affirmed without a word of thanks. Settling down, she crossed her legs elegantly, her gaze sweeping over the cafe as if inspecting the place to ensure it met her standards. Conversations gradually resumed, but some patrons continued to steal discreet glances at Claire. She seemed unfazed, accustomed to being the center of attention wherever she went. At that moment, she leaned slightly over the table, picking up the menu with delicate fingers. Interesting. They have an exclusive Ethiopian blend," she murmured to herself, though loud enough for the two patrons at the neighboring table to hear. As she perused the menu, a barista at the counter arranged cups with precise movements. He appeared oblivious to Claire's presence, focused on his work as though his routine was an art form. She noticed, and her eyes gleamed momentarily, perhaps appraising his simplicity with a touch of superiority. The scene seemed frozen in a perfect tableau: the cafe's elegance, the murmurs of refined clientele, and Claire's impeccable posture, dictating the ambience with her mere presence. The soft stumble of a waitress balancing a tray nearly broke the spell. Claire cast a quick but indifferent glance before returning to her observation of the surroundings. She picked up her phone and began scrolling, as though the time there was a mere interlude in her important schedule. The world could wait for Claire, but Claire waited for no one. That morning, Maison du Café seemed an extension of her personality, refined, exclusive, and untouchable. Yet, as always happens when things seem too perfect, the unexpected was about to unfold. And although Claire didn't know it yet, that day would be anything but ordinary. Claire drummed her long, well-manicured fingers on the marble table, her eyes flickering toward the counter. "This is taking longer than it should," she muttered, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. A waitress approached with a nervous smile, politely asking if she needed anything. "Yes, I need efficiency," Claire replied, handing over the menu with a theatrical motion. "I don't have all day." Her order was more a list of demands than a request. The coffee needed to be prepared at an exact temperature, the milk perfectly frothed, and the accompaniment had to include the freshest artisanal dessert the cafe offered. "And don't bring me anything that's been sitting in the display for more than 10 minutes, she added, with a look that seemed to issue a challenge. The waitress nodded quickly, nearly stumbling as she hurried back to the counter, while Claire sighed dramatically and returned to her phone. Across the room, an elderly woman glanced up from her cup, her brows furrowing slightly. Her husband, noticing the scene, shook his head and whispered something inaudible. Claire was entirely oblivious to the disapproving glances beginning to form among the patrons. To her, everyone was either there to serve her or admire her commanding demeanor. Her impatience grew. When she saw that her order had still not arrived, Claire rose abruptly, the sound of her chair scraping against the floor echoing in the hushed cafe. She marched to the counter, where the barista continued his work in silence. "Do I really have to come here to ensure the job gets done right?" she asked, her voice laced with sharp sarcasm. Some customers began murmuring amongst themselves, trying not to be obvious as they observed the unfolding scene. A young woman at a nearby table typed something on her phone, likely recounting the moment in real time. Claire, however, appeared indifferent to the growing buzz around her. Her focus was fixed on the barista, waiting for a reaction that would reaffirm what she believed to be her superior position. When her coffee was finally delivered, She picked up the cup with exaggerated theatricality, swirling it in her hand as if evaluating a piece of art. "I hope this time at least it's something decent," she said with a thin, venomous smile. Taking her first sip, she paused, frowned, and placed the cup back on the counter with a deliberate but clearly intentional motion. "It's lukewarm. The coffee is lukewarm." She emphasized each word as though pronouncing an irrevocable sentence. The barista, who continued working with the same calmness, glanced up at her but said nothing. This seemed to irritate her even more. "I asked for something simple, and even that can't be done properly?" she snapped, with a dry laugh that cut through the air like thunder. Those around her were visibly uncomfortable. A man in a suit adjusted his tie as if trying to distract himself, while a mother pulled her daughter closer, whispering something in her ear. However, no one dared intervene directly. It was as though they were watching a disconcerting performance they couldn't look away from. Claire looked at the watch on her wrist, a rare and exorbitantly priced model, and sighed loudly. "I think I'll need to review this place's entire operation," she said, more to herself but loud enough for everyone to hear. She returned to her table with firm steps, leaving a trail of tension in her wake. The cafe, once a haven of tranquility and sophistication, now seemed to pulse with the restless energy of her arrogance. And at that moment, no one could have predicted how that seemingly ordinary morning was about to change forever. The marble counter gleamed under the cafe's soft lights, reflecting Henry's agile and careful hands as he meticulously arranged the neatly aligned cups. His presence was discreet, almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying attention, yet there was something in his serene demeanor that radiated unshakable calm. Dressed in a spotless black apron and a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, he seemed the embodiment of simplicity and efficiency. His slightly tousled brown hair looked almost intentional, a contrast that humanized his meticulous posture. His eyes carried an unusual depth, as though they saw beyond the moment, beyond the cafe, and beyond the attitudes of those around him. He worked with a concentration that almost made his movements a choreography, a silent and methodical dance between coffee steam and the sound of milk being heated. When Claire returned to her table, still grumbling about the lukewarm coffee, Henry glanced briefly in her direction, but without showing any emotion beyond fleeting curiosity. He wasn't the type to react hastily or be shaken by minor storms around him. To him, his work was about purpose rather than the opinions of those on the other side of the counter. "Henry, can you handle this order?" asked a waitress as she hurried past him, handing him Claire's ticket as if it were a hot potato. He nodded without hesitation, with a slight smile that seemed to say, "Leave it to me." The quick glance he gave the paper was followed by a brief adjustment of his apron as he approached the espresso machine. Across the room, some patrons who had noticed the earlier scene now watched Henry with curiosity. There was a quiet dignity about him, something that contrasted sharply with Claire's demeanor. To the casual observer, he was just another barista, but to those paying attention, he seemed to carry a confidence that defied the simplicity of his uniform. "Excuse me," he said as he approached the counter where Claire was seated. His voice was low but firm, with a tone that seemed to carry a magnetic calm. He placed the cup carefully in front of her, explaining in a few words how he had adjusted the specifications to meet her request. Despite his courtesy, there was a noticeable absence of servility in his tone, something that did not escape Claire, even if she didn't immediately acknowledge it. His upright posture and the way he held his hands, clasped in front of him, gave the impression of someone who was exactly where they wanted to be, a rare quality for a barista, especially under the sharp gaze of someone like Claire. The murmurs in the cafe began to subside, as though Henry's presence brought a more serene energy, capable of absorbing some of the tension Claire had created moments earlier. As he continued preparing other orders, moving across the counter with an almost poetic fluidity, the contrast between him and Claire became even more apparent. She, a storm of nerves and haughtiness; he, the calm before and after the storm. With every step Henry took, he seemed to leave a trail of tranquility in the air, as though even the environment respected the serenity he radiated. There was something about him, a mystery that no one could quite pinpoint. It wasn't arrogance, nor an attempt to stand out, it was simply a natural air of confidence, almost disconcerting in its subtlety. And at that moment, without Claire or any other customer realizing it, he was about to change the course of that morning in an irrevocable way. Claire twirled the diamond ring on her finger with an expression of rehearsed impatience, watching Henry as he read the ticket. "Come on, it's not rocket science, is it?" she said in a slightly harsh tone, crossing her arms theatrically. Her voice echoed louder than necessary, interrupting the quiet conversations at some nearby tables. The order was an intricate combination: a latte with almond milk heated precisely to 65 degrees, a touch of organic cinnamon, and finally, a perfectly drawn leaf design in the foam. "I hope it doesn't take more than 5 minutes. My time is worth gold," she added, with a faint smirk that felt more like a provocation than a courtesy. Henry, as calm as before, gave a slight nod. "Of course, ma'am, I'll do my best to meet your request," he replied, his voice firm but without any trace of annoyance. He turned toward the coffee machine with measured steps, while Claire continued to watch him, seemingly waiting for the moment he would slip up. "So, is that how it works? You don't check the temperature? Or are you just guessing?" Claire suddenly interjected, leaning toward the counter. Henry paused for a brief moment, turned his head in her direction, and smiled. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'm used to handling details like these. Precision is important." That response should have reassured Claire, but instead, it made her arch an eyebrow. "Oh, wonderful. Another philosopher behind the counter," she said, chuckling lightly at her own joke. Some nearby patrons averted their gaze, uneasy with the way she seemed to openly mock Henry. He, however, remained unfazed, pouring the milk into the cup with the precision of an artist. When he handed over the order, sliding the cup toward her with care, Claire quickly took a sip. A brief silence followed, and then she frowned, holding the cup as if examining a defective product. "Unbelievable. This isn't right," she declared, shaking her head in exaggerated disapproval. "My apologies, ma'am. What exactly didn't meet your expectations?" Henry asked, without raising his voice, but with a tone that conveyed genuine attention. Claire smiled sarcastically, tilting her head. "Do you want to start with the temperature or the lack of flavor? Or maybe the design in the foam? A leaf? Is that the best you can do?" Hearing the final jab, some customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Henry, however, maintained his composure. "I understand, ma'am. I can remake the order if you'd like. I'm here to ensure your satisfaction," he said, the serenity in his voice forming a stark contrast to the venom in Claire's words. "Maybe you should reconsider your career," Claire replied, her voice cutting as she leaned back in her chair with a triumphant expression. Henry, instead of reacting, took a step back, tilted his head politely, and began cleaning the counter, as though her words were nothing more than distant noise. The scene, now capturing the attention of practically everyone in the cafe, felt like a battle of opposites. Claire, with her storm of criticism, tried to dominate the space. Henry, with his calmness, seemed to absorb the impact without yielding. Yet, for those watching, there was a sense that this was only the beginning, a prelude to something much greater. Claire leaned slightly forward, resting her elbow on the table and tapping the spoon against the edge of the cup in a rhythmic motion, as if it were a countdown. Her voice, louder than before, sliced through the cafe like a blade. "Is this what they call luxury service? Or is hiring here based on charity?" she asked, with a cynical smile that made her words sound even crueler. Some customers looked up, surprised by the comment. Others lowered their heads, pretending not to hear but clearly uncomfortable with the scene. Henry, standing behind the counter, calmly cleaned a tray with a clean cloth, his expression unchanged. Claire, irritated by his lack of reaction, took advantage of the audience that was beginning to form. "Don't get me wrong," she continued, spinning the cup in her hand as if it were a trophy. "I respect all professions. I mean, someone has to do the heavy lifting, right? I just didn't expect it to be done with such incompetence." She emphasized the last word, letting it resonate in the silent room. A faint laugh escaped Claire's lips, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Imagine that. It's not so hard to press buttons and froth milk, is it? Maybe I should teach a thing or two about efficiency. Who knows, in another life, you might even climb the career ladder." The comment, dripping with sarcasm, drew embarrassed looks from those nearby. Henry raised his eyes for the first time, but not to confront her. He merely looked at her with a neutral expression, without averting his gaze, as if trying to understand what had driven such bitterness. Claire, however, saw this as a challenge. "Oh, so you have something to say? Or do you prefer to keep pretending you know what you're doing? If you need help, just ask," she added, leaning on the counter with her hands, the rings on her fingers gleaming under the light. "I can call someone more qualified. Maybe someone with a bit more experience. This clearly isn't your forte." Her voice carried an almost musical tone, as if she were telling a joke only she found amusing. Some customers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while a young woman nearby shook her head, whispering something to her companion. But Claire seemed immune to the discomfort she was causing, more focused on asserting her position than on noticing the unease spreading around her. Henry, as calm as ever, leaned slightly toward her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry if the service didn't meet your expectations. I can remake your order or adjust it to your liking." His voice was so serene it seemed to disarm the venom in her words, but Claire wasn't about to back down. "You don't understand, do you? The problem isn't the coffee. It's you." Claire smiled triumphantly, leaning back in her chair, as if she had just won an imaginary debate. The humiliation seemed to be the spectacle she wanted to offer the onlookers, a makeshift stage where she could star as the main attraction. Yet there was something in Henry's eyes, a firmness, a tranquil depth, that countered the environment Claire was trying to create. He didn't need to raise his voice or engage in her game. Somehow, this seemed to irritate her even more, as if his calmness was a mirror reflecting the chaos she herself had caused. Maison du Café, which moments before had been a haven of sophistication and tranquility, was now steeped in an uncomfortable silence. Every biting word from Claire seemed to echo louder than it should, filling the corners of the café with palpable tension. The occasional clink of a spoon against a cup or the soft hum of the espresso machine now felt insufficient to break the heavy atmosphere she had created. An elderly woman near the window adjusted her glasses and cast a disapproving glance in Claire's direction before discreetly shaking her head. Her husband, a man in a gray suit, whispered something while holding her hand, trying to prevent her indignation from escalating into intervention. "What a situation," he murmured, not loudly enough for Claire to hear. Other patrons exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others keeping their eyes fixed on their tables as if trying to escape the awkwardness. Even the laughter from a group in the corner, young people who had clearly been discussing something trivial moments earlier, faded away. Now, everyone seemed captivated by the discomfort, unable to look away from the scene. Behind the counter, the other staff members watched Henry with expressions that oscillated between concern and admiration. A young waitress, still holding a tray with 2 cups, looked at him as if waiting for a sign to intervene. Her fingers gripped the tray tightly, almost trembling, but she didn't move. The shift manager, a man with graying hair and a black tie, took a hesitant step forward but stopped when he noticed Henry's demeanor. With a deep sigh, he stepped back, crossing his arms and leaning against the wall, as if realizing that this moment belonged solely to the barista. Henry's composure was almost unsettling. He moved with the same precision and serenity as before, even under the expectant gazes of his colleagues and the clientele. It was as though the weight of Claire's words didn't affect him, or at least as though he had learned to carry it with dignity. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to relish the impact she was having. She looked around with a satisfied smile, aware that she was the center of attention. "Is no one going to say anything?" she provoked, leaning over the table again and observing Henry as if waiting for him to finally react. But he didn't react. He didn't raise his voice or quicken his movements. He simply continued cleaning the counter, organizing the cups, and going about his work with the same unshakable calm. This serenity seemed to irritate Claire even more, as if his silence was an act of defiance. Meanwhile, the customers' gazes alternated between Claire and Henry, as if they were watching a play with an unpredictable next act. There was a palpable feeling of anticipation in the air. Something was about to happen. And though no one knew what it would be, they couldn't tear their eyes away, caught in the growing tension. At that moment, even the air seemed heavier, laden with unspoken emotions and unexpressed thoughts. Maison du Café was no longer the same. And Henry, without uttering a word, seemed to be preparing the stage for something no one would ever forget. Henry took a step forward, stopping in front of Claire with a calmness that seemed almost challenging in its serenity. His eyes, deep and composed, met hers for a brief moment, but instead of anger or resentment, there was only something Claire couldn't identify: understanding. He wiped his hands on his apron with a slow and deliberate gesture before speaking, his voice clear and low, yet firm enough to carry across the café. "Ma'am," he began with a disarming gentleness, "I'm sorry if my work didn't meet your expectations. My goal is always to offer the best to every customer because I believe that serving is a form of respect, not submission." The careful choice of his words made some customers sit up straighter in their chairs, eager to hear what he would say next. "I've always believed that the value of a person isn't in the position they hold but in the dignity with which they do what needs to be done," he continued, still not raising his voice. "What I do here isn't just making coffee or taking orders. It's contributing to a special moment in the lives of each person who walks through these doors." Claire crossed her arms, tilting her head with an expression that wavered between irritation and curiosity. "That's inspiring," she said, with a hint of sarcasm that didn't seem to faze Henry. He simply smiled slightly before continuing. I understand that we don't always see things the same way, Henry said, leaning slightly toward the counter, drawing closer to Claire but maintaining a respectful distance. And sometimes when we're quick to judge, we miss the chance to see the true value of the people around us. His tone carried no accusation. It was as if he were speaking to someone who needed to hear this, but without imposing anything. The other customers were completely captivated, as if the entire room were holding its breath. Even the waitress holding the tray froze in place, her eyes fixed on Henry. No matter what I do or where I am, Henry said, straightening up. Whether I'm making coffee or leading an important meeting, what defines me is how I treat others and how I choose to conduct myself. And that, I believe, is the true measure of success. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle in the room. Claire narrowed her eyes, clearly unsettled by her inability to rattle him. Yet there was something else in her expression, a flicker of doubt or discomfort, as if, for the first time, her own actions were being called into question. The customers around them began whispering softly, commenting on the weight of Henry's words. Even so, no one dared to interrupt. Claire, sensing that she was losing control of the situation, opened her mouth to respond, but Henry had already turned away, returning to tidying the counter as though nothing had happened. The tension in the air remained, but it had shifted, a different kind of tension, one charged with expectation. Henry hadn't revealed anything personal, but his words carried a weight that no one in the cafe could ignore. He had made it clear that Claire had underestimated something, perhaps him, perhaps the work he did, perhaps even the very concept of respect. Whatever it was, everyone in the cafe could feel that the story wasn't over yet. A woman with short brown hair and stylish glasses, seated at a table near the counter, could no longer contain her indignation. With an audible sigh, she stood up, adjusted her cream-colored coat and crossed her arms. I think that's enough, she said firmly, her gaze fixed on Claire. You've been rude and disrespectful to someone who is clearly just trying to do their job. The murmurs in the cafe ceased instantly. The unexpected interruption drew approving glances from some patrons and incredulous looks from others, surprised that someone had finally confronted Claire. The heiress, visibly irritated, turned to the woman with an ironic smile. And who are you exactly? The defender of the oppressed, she retorted, her tone as biting as it had been all morning. Before the situation could escalate further, Henry intervened with a calm gesture. It's all right, ma'am, he said to the woman who had come to his defense. I appreciate your concern, but I can handle this. His words, spoken with gentleness, seemed to suggest that he had something to say, something that would change everything. Henry approached the counter, wiping his hands on a towel, and looked directly at Claire. For a moment, the silence in the cafe was almost deafening. Then, in a calm and firm tone, he said, I believe there's something you and perhaps everyone here should know. I'm not standing behind this counter today out of necessity. I'm here because I chose to be. Claire furrowed her brow, confused. You chose to be? What kind of excuse is that? She asked, her voice filled with disdain. But something in Henry's eyes made her stop. He took a deep breath before continuing, I am the owner of this cafe chain. This establishment and all others under the name Maison du Café belong to me. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Every gaze was fixed on Henry, and then, like a ripple spreading outward, the murmurs began. Some customers whispered to one another, while others looked at Claire, waiting for her reaction. She, meanwhile, remained frozen, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and shock. You're joking, right? Claire finally managed to say, though her voice sounded weaker than before. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared, and she was grasping at any fragment of certainty. You're the owner? Henry nodded lightly. Yes, I'm the owner. I'm here today because I was covering for an absent employee. For me, there's no such thing as a small job, especially when it comes to ensuring that every customer has the best experience possible. He spoke with humility, without a trace of arrogance, yet his words carried a weight that no one could ignore. Claire blinked several times as if trying to process what she had just heard. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and the aura of superiority that had surrounded her began to crumble. The flush spreading across her face was impossible to hide. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come, swallowed by the shame now engulfing her. Meanwhile, Henry calmly turned back to his work, proceeding with the same serenity as before. His revelation hung in the air like the climax of a theatrical performance, leaving everyone in the cafe with the sense that they had witnessed something extraordinary, and for Claire, something profoundly humiliating. The initial silence was broken by timid murmurs that spread like wildfire. He's the owner? whispered a young woman with curly hair to the man sitting beside her, who simply nodded, wide-eyed. "I've heard about him," commented another woman in a low voice, loud enough for nearby tables to catch. It was as if Maison du Café had turned into the stage of a live spectacle, and no one wanted to miss a single moment. Claire, on the other hand, seemed paralyzed in her chair. She clutched the strap of her purse tightly, her face still flushed a deep red. Attempting to regain her composure, she raised her chin slightly, but her eyes, which had previously burned with superiority, now wavered, avoiding direct contact with either Henry or the surrounding patrons. A waitress passed by her, balancing a tray, and Claire watched her for a moment as though searching for a distraction. But the weight of her embarrassment was too overwhelming to ignore. When she tried to speak, the words tangled and she gave up, gripping her purse strap even tighter. Meanwhile, Henry continued working as if nothing had happened. He prepared a cappuccino with the same precision and dedication as before, responding with a kind smile to the thanks of a customer who clearly made a point to show her admiration for his demeanor. His behavior diffused any potential discomfort in the environment, reaffirming his presence as someone who led by example. "That's what I call class," murmured a man in a suit to his companion. He didn't even have to raise his voice, he added, impressed. The comment reached Claire's ears, making her quickly avert her gaze, biting her lower lip as if holding back an emotion threatening to overflow. Even among the other employees, the atmosphere had shifted. The waitress, who earlier seemed nervous, now wore a subtle smile as she arranged the plates. The manager, leaning against a corner, crossed his arms with an expression of evident respect. Henry had reaffirmed what everyone already knew. He was not just a business owner but a leader who valued every detail and every person. Claire, however, kept trying to maintain her composure. She ran her hands through her hair, adjusting it as if trying to rebuild a facade of confidence that had crumbled moments before. But the gazes around her were inescapable. Some were disapproving, others sympathetic, but all seemed to remind her that, on that day, the power she had so often flaunted had been overshadowed by something far greater: Henry's humility. The environment, still marked by a mix of tension and curiosity, began to return to normal, but not completely. Some people still whispered, while others kept an eye on Claire, waiting to see what she would do next. Henry, on the other hand, seemed uninterested in prolonging the moment. He continued serving customers, his calm and humble demeanor making it clear there was no room for resentment in his heart. It was impossible not to notice the contrast between the two. Claire, drowned in shame, and Henry, elevated by the dignity of his actions. As he calmly organized the counter, the true lesson of the day lingered in the air like the aroma of coffee. Respect and humility were the greatest treasures anyone could possess. Claire abruptly stood up from her chair, the metallic screech of the furniture's feet scraping against the floor echoing through the cafe. All eyes turned to her, but she avoided their gaze. With quick steps, she crossed the room, trying to ignore the murmurs that seemed to follow her like a ghost. With each step, her pride crumbled further, and the confidence she once wore like armor now seemed too heavy to bear. She adjusted her coat over her shoulders while clutching her bag tightly against her body, a nearly instinctive gesture of self-protection. Her heels struck rhythmically against the marble floor, but even the sound, once commanding, now seemed awkward and hurried. On her way to the door, she stumbled slightly but regained her balance before anyone could notice. At least that's what she hoped. The doorbell chimed again as Claire exited the Maison du Café, this time almost symbolically, a retreat from the scene she had created herself. Outside, the fresh wind touched her face but wasn't enough to erase the blush marking her cheeks. She clutched her coat tighter and walked along the sidewalk, head down, ignoring the curious glances of a few pedestrians who saw her leave in haste. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere was a mix of relief and curiosity. A customer at a nearby table whispered something to their companion, who nodded with a discreet smile. "She couldn't handle it," said a man near the counter, his tone carrying more a sense of justice than cruelty. Henry, however, remained exactly as he had been before. While everyone focused on Claire, he concentrated on finishing an order, adding a touch of cinnamon to the cappuccino he had just prepared. His serenity seemed almost intentional, as if to emphasize that, for him, the incident had ended there. "Thank you for waiting," he said with a kind smile as he handed the cup to a customer. The person, visibly impressed, made sure to praise him. "You're a man of great class." "I would have reacted differently." Henry merely shrugged lightly, not letting the comment inflate his ego. The employees exchanged glances, many suppressing relieved smiles. The young waitress, who had earlier hesitated to intervene, now seemed more confident, adjusting the tray in her hands with a bit more firmness. Henry had once again transformed a difficult situation into a silent lesson, resonating not only with the customers but also with those working alongside him. Even after Claire's departure, the sense that something extraordinary had occurred lingered in the air. Some continued whispering, others looked at Henry with renewed admiration, but he showed no interest in becoming the center of attention. He cleaned the counter with the same patience as before, as if nothing had happened. What no one could ignore, however, was the impact of the moment. Claire's hasty and clumsy exit contrasted sharply with Henry's unwavering calm. For those present, the message was clear. True strength lies not in the power we flaunt but in how we choose to respond to adversity. That afternoon, a young woman sitting at a table near the counter uploaded a video to TikTok, describing the incident she had witnessed at the Maison du Café. "Guys, you won't believe what happened. The spoiled heiress freaked out at the barista, only to discover he's the owner of the place. It was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen." Read the text overlaid on the video, which captured part of Henry's speech and the moment Claire left in a hurry. The video quickly garnered thousands of likes and shares, with comments praising Henry's demeanor. "Class and humility, that's what the world needs," wrote one user. "This man deserves an award," said another. In contrast, criticism of Claire quickly emerged. Comments like "arrogance has its limits," and "she got what she deserved" were the most liked, fueling the wave of disapproval. Soon, the story spread across other platforms. On Twitter, hashtags like #HumbleOwner and #secondhand embarrassment for Claire trended. Photos of Henry serving customers began circulating, accompanied by inspiring captions like "To lead is to serve." Meanwhile, people tried to learn more about Claire, who was quickly identified as a well-known figure in the local elite. In messaging groups and discussion forums, details of the incident were debated as if part of a major event. Some focused on the elegance with which Henry handled the situation, while others harshly criticized Claire's behavior. "It's a portrait of privilege without empathy," one commenter wrote. "She thought she was above it all, but life taught her the hard way." In no time, local media outlets began covering the story. News portals published articles with titles such as "Owner of Renowned Coffee Chain Teaches Arrogant Customer a Lesson in Humility," and "Henry, the Leader Who Turned a Crisis into an Example." Images of the crowded cafe, now a symbol of respect and empathy, illustrated the reports. While Henry was hailed as an example of leadership and dignity, Claire faced the weight of public exposure. Her identity, once flaunted with pride, now became a source of embarrassment. Anonymous profiles on social media shared old videos of her at parties or fashion shows, commenting, "She's always been arrogant, and now we know who she really is." Amid the uproar, Henry was approached by journalists. He declined all interviews with the same polite response: "I prefer to let my actions speak for themselves. My role here is simply to serve my customers well." This refusal to exploit the unexpected fame only reinforced the public's admiration, who saw him as genuinely humble. Claire, on the other hand, was surrounded by criticism. Her social media accounts, once filled with glamorous photos, became a minefield of negative comments. Despite trying to maintain silence, the pressure was evident. Some close friends advised her to leave the city for a while others suggested she issue a public apology. Day by day, the story gained more layers. For Henry, the incident was just further proof that leading with kindness had a profound impact. For Claire, however, it was an opportunity, or a punishment, that would mark her life forever. But the world didn't yet know that this episode would not be the end of the story. A week after the incident, the Maison du Café was as bustling as usual. The familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the sounds of lively conversations and the clinking of cups against saucers. Everything seemed to follow its normal course until the door opened, and a subtle silence spread through the room, as if an invisible breeze had swept through the place. Claire entered hesitantly, a stark contrast to the commanding presence she had displayed during her previous visit. Her clothing, once adorned with luxury brands, was now simple and understated: a beige sweater, black trousers, and low-heeled shoes. Her hair, previously styled in an immaculate bun, fell naturally in loose waves over her shoulders. There were no flashy jewels or overpowering perfume, just Claire transformed. The customers near the entrance paused their conversations, clearly recognizing her. Whispers began to circulate among the tables. "Is it her?" someone murmured. "Is she here to cause more trouble?" another asked. But her demeanor diffused any speculation. Her slightly hunched shoulders and wandering gaze, which never settled on anyone, conveyed vulnerability. She took a few steps inside and stopped as if gathering her courage. A waitress approached her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone gentle but cautious. Claire raised her eyes, hesitated for a moment, and responded softly, "I'd like to speak with Henry. Is he here today?" The request made the waitress raise an eyebrow momentarily, but she quickly composed herself. "I'll check," she replied, moving swiftly to the counter. Henry was behind the coffee machine, preparing an order when the waitress pulled him aside and whispered something to him. His eyes turned toward Claire, and he remained still for a moment, assessing the situation. Claire noticed his glance and seemed to shrink slightly, almost as if she wished to disappear. Yet, instead of looking away, she held her ground, albeit with visible difficulty. Henry nodded to the waitress, placed the cup he was preparing on the counter, and wiped his hands on his apron before approaching her. The cafe, until then noisy and full of life, fell into an expectant silence. Customers who had witnessed the earlier incident or heard about it now watched intently, as if they were watching the unfolding of a soap opera. Claire seemed to feel the weight of every gaze but stood her ground, breathing deeply as Henry walked toward her. "Can I help you?" Henry asked, his voice calm and polite, without a trace of hostility or irony. He looked at her with the same serenity that had marked his demeanor the last time they had met. Claire swallowed hard before answering, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I need to talk to you. Just you." There was something in her tone, a genuine vulnerability that surprised even the most skeptical onlookers in the cafe. Henry gestured for her to follow him to a more private area of the establishment, away from the main tables. As they walked, the murmurs resumed, but this time with a different tone, less judgmental and more curious. Something significant was about to happen, and no one wanted to miss its resolution. Claire sat in a simple chair in the reserved area of the cafe, her hands clasped in her lap, her fingers nervously intertwining as if searching for stability. Henry sat across from her, maintaining his calm demeanor. He didn't say anything, simply waited, giving Claire the space she clearly needed to begin. She took a deep breath, but her voice faltered on her first attempt to speak. I need to apologize," she finally managed, looking down. Her eyes avoided Henry's as if the weight of her guilt was too heavy to bear. "What I did that day was unacceptable. I behaved like someone I don't even recognize anymore." Henry remained silent, listening attentively. There was no judgment in his expression, only a patient gaze that seemed to give Claire the reassurance to continue. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes glistening as though holding back tears. "I was arrogant, disrespectful. And, to be honest, I was taking out on you things that had nothing to do with you." The words began to pour out faster, as if they had been bottled up for too long. "I grew up being taught to judge people by what they do, not by who they are. And that's wrong. But on that day I didn't think about any of that. I just wanted to feel superior. And now I see how cruel and petty that was." Claire paused, took another deep breath, and for the first time looked directly at Henry. Her voice trembled, but there was a sincere determination in her words. "I'm sorry. Not just for what I said, but for how I acted, for how I treated you. No one deserves that. And you, above all, showed the kind of person I should aspire to be." Even from a safe distance, the cafe seemed to hold its collective breath along with her. Henry remained motionless for a moment, and then, finally, a soft smile appeared on his face. He leaned forward slightly and said, with the firm and gentle tone that had already won over so many people, "The courage to recognize a mistake and apologize is a bigger step than most people are willing to take. I accept your apology, Claire." The simplicity of his response made Claire blink rapidly, as if it were hard to process something so generous and pure. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking but filled with relief. "I don't deserve your kindness, but I hope that one day I can be better." Henry shook his head gently. "We all have something to learn, Claire. What matters is what we do with what we've learned. If this made you reflect and grow, then it was worth it." He extended his hand in a gesture of reconciliation, and Claire, without hesitation, grasped it firmly, as if that handshake symbolized a new beginning. The tension in the reserved area seemed to dissipate, and Claire, even with tear-filled eyes, appeared lighter. Henry stood up first and politely gestured for her to follow him back to the main room. The moment between them had ended, but its impact still reverberated in the air. For everyone present, that conversation was more than just an apology, it was a silent lesson in humility, dignity, and the power of forgiveness. In the days following that apology, the Maison du Café became more than just a place of luxury and flavor. For its patrons, it was now a symbol of something much greater, the transformative power of humility and forgiveness. The episode between Claire and Henry became a story shared not only on social media but also in conversations among customers, inspiring deep reflections on respect and empathy. Claire, once remembered for her arrogance, began to carve out a new path. Little by little, she started appearing at city events, no longer as the flashy heiress of the past, but as someone genuinely interested in listening and learning. Her outfits remained elegant, but now carried a simplicity that conveyed authenticity rather than ostentation. Gradually, she regained her place in society, this time in a way that earned genuine respect. For his part, Henry remained as he had always been, calm, attentive, and completely indifferent to the fame surrounding him. The Maison du Café saw a significant increase in customers, but Henry continued to focus on ensuring that each cup of coffee was prepared with the same care as always. "Here, everyone is equal," he often told his employees, reinforcing the philosophy that had made him so admired. One day, Claire returned to the café, not as an unexpected surprise, but as part of her routine. She arrived early before the café filled up, and ordered a simple coffee without any extravagant demands. When Henry saw her, he gave her a polite smile and made sure to personally attend to her order. "It's good to have you back," he said, handing her the cup with his usual calm demeanor. Claire thanked him with a timid but sincere smile. The moment marked a full circle, where two worlds that had once clashed learned to coexist. For Claire, the café became a place of reflection, a space where she reconnected with the humanity she had neglected for so long. For Henry, it was living proof that his example had not only taught her something but also touched many other lives. The story of Claire and Henry took on new interpretations over time. In an article published by a local newspaper, a columnist wrote, "What happened at the Maison du Café was not just a lesson for Claire but for all of us. We live in a world where status and appearances often dictate how we treat others. And then someone like Henry comes along to remind us that true power lies in kindness." Henry, however, never let the praise affect him. He continued to work discreetly, encouraging his employees to treat every customer, without exception, with respect and care. "We don't do this for recognition," he often said, "but because it's the right thing to do." His example not only solidified the success of the café chain but also inspired other businesses to adopt a more human approach in their practices. Claire, for her part, went beyond just changing her behavior. She began using her position to promote initiatives focused on worker well-being, something she had never considered before. When asked about the reason for the change, she simply replied, "Someone showed me that true greatness isn't about what we have but about what we are capable of giving." In the end, the story of Claire and Henry left an impact that went beyond the walls of the Maison du Café. It became a reminder that moments of tension can be opportunities for growth and that no one is beyond the possibility of change, as long as they are willing to recognize their faults and take the first step. As Henry served another customer on a busy morning, he glanced out the window and saw Claire walking down the street, a serene smile on her face. He didn't say anything, simply continued working, confident that in some way their story, though concluded, would continue to echo in all who had heard it. And the aroma of coffee, as always, filled the air, gentle and comforting, like the very lesson that had been born there. 10 years later, the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee and freshly baked madeleines filled the air, mingling with the soft sound of a piano playing in the background. The Maison du Café maintained its classic and welcoming atmosphere, but now there was something different about it. The space seemed more alive, more diverse, welcoming not only the elite but people from all walks of life. At a corner table, near the large glass window that reflected the golden light of the setting sun, Henry was seated with an open notebook, reviewing some notes. The years had added gray streaks to his temples, but his calm and kind expression remained untouched, as if time had only reinforced his aura of serenity. The door opened, and the sound of the familiar chime caught Henry's attention, making him glance up distractedly. A woman entered, moving gracefully but without ostentation. Her brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and she wore a simple navy blue dress, complemented by a serene smile that lit up her face. Henry took a moment to recognize her, but when their eyes met, a flash of memory crossed his gaze. It was Claire. "May I sit down?" she asked, her tone carrying a mix of nervousness and emotion. Henry gestured toward the chair in front of him, observing her with curiosity. "Of course, please do. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" he said with a warm smile. Claire nodded, settling into the chair carefully. There was something in her eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before, a wisdom gained through lived experiences. 10 years to be exact, Claire began, resting her hands delicately on the table. And all this time I've wanted the opportunity to thank you. I couldn't let it pass today." Henry leaned forward slightly, genuinely interested. "Thank me? I don't recall doing anything so extraordinary," he replied, his tone modest as ever. Claire let out a light, almost incredulous laugh. "Oh, but you did. More than you can imagine," she continued, her voice tinged with emotion. "That day at the cafe was a turning point in my life. At the time I didn't realize it, but you planted a seed in me that I desperately needed. Humility." Henry listened attentively, allowing Claire to unburden herself. "I spent a long time reflecting on the words you said to me about dignity, about valuing people for who they are and not what they do. It was as if something inside me broke, something that needed to break." The world around them seemed to fade away as Claire spoke, as though the entire cafe was suspended in the narrative she was weaving. "I went home that day and looked at myself in the mirror for the first time, really looked. I didn't like what I saw, Henry. It was painful to admit, but I realized my entire life had been built around vanity, privilege, and emptiness." She paused, taking a deep breath, as if still feeling the weight of her words. "So, I decided to change," she said firmly. "I started small. I let go of everything superficial and dedicated myself to studying, to understanding how I could contribute to the world in a meaningful way. It was a long journey, but I managed to find my purpose." Henry's eyes shone with a mix of surprise and admiration. "And what did you find?" he asked, genuinely curious. Claire smiled, a smile unlike any Henry had ever seen on her before. "I earned a degree in psychology, and in recent years I've been working to help people reconnect with who they are. Especially young people who, like me, grew up surrounded by unrealistic expectations and distorted values. I wouldn't have gotten here without that day, without that lesson." She paused, her eyes fixed on his. "You were the catalyst for all of this." Henry remained silent for a moment, absorbing the impact of her words. "I'm glad to have made a difference, Claire. But you did all the work. You're the one who chose to change," he said with a humble smile. She shook her head. "No, Henry. You gave me an invaluable gift. You showed me that no matter where we are or what we have, what truly matters is how we choose to treat others and ourselves." The door chime rang again, and the sound of footsteps briefly relieved the intensity of the moment. Claire glanced at the table next to them, where a young man appeared nervous as Henry greeted him briefly before returning to the conversation. "I needed you to know, Henry. I wanted you to understand the impact you had on my life, even without intending to." She placed her hand on the table, close to his, but without touching. "I hope this inspires you too. You changed my life for the better." Henry tilted his head, his gaze filled with gratitude. "Knowing that is enough, Claire. Knowing that even a small action can have such significant outcomes. That's all anyone could wish for." He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before asking, "And what brought you back to the cafe today after all these years?" Claire smiled again, this time with a touch of humor. "Besides thanking you, I wanted to taste the best cappuccino in town. At least that hasn't changed," she joked. They both laughed, and the weight of the conversation seemed to dissolve, leaving only a feeling of renewal. That afternoon, as the sun set, Henry watched Claire leave the cafe. Her steps were firm yet light, as if she had finally found her place in the world. And as he watched her disappear into the street crowd, he felt something rare: pride. Not for himself, but for her and the transformation he had witnessed. As Henry returned to his work, he found himself reflecting on Claire's words and the impact that small actions can have. The aroma of coffee filled the air, serving as a subtle reminder that each day brings new opportunities to change lives, one cup at a time. The cycle had come full circle, but the lessons lived in that cafe would continue to resonate for a long time in all who passed through its doors. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Claire and Henry, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love heartwarming chronicles and wish to support our channel in continuing to deliver high-quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next inspiring chronicle.